The transmission lasted 4 seconds. That was all it took. Specialist Hiroshi Uemura had been awake for 31 hours when he fat-fingered the routing command, and the Colonial Defense Network's entire tactical database, troop positions, weapons manifests, encrypted command hierarchies for every installation between Earth and the Kepler belt, went screaming out into open space on a civilian broadcast frequency. He realized what he'd done approximately 3 seconds to the transmission completed. The 4th second he spent staring at his screen with his mouth open. Then he said very quietly, "Oh no." His supervisor, senior technician Daigoro Hanakawato, was across the room entertaining a delegation of contractors when Uemura's face went the color of old chalk. Hanakawato had what Uemura privately called a gift for being exactly where things were about to go wrong. Not because he caused the problems, but because Hanakawato's entire management philosophy was built on the premise that if you greased enough palms and smiled wide enough and kept the drinks coming, problems had a way of not becoming your problem. He had held 3 postings in 5 years and had been promoted at each one. It was a kind of genius. Tani, Uemura said, barely above a whisper. Akira Tani, the programming specialist, swiveled in his chair. He was 26, the youngest member of their communications unit, and he had the particular expression of a man who has already run the numbers and doesn't like the answer. "Tell me," Tani said. "I sent it. Sent all of it." Tani's mouth went thin. He rolled his chair to Uemura's station, pulled up the transmission log, and sat very still for several seconds. Outside, the contractors laughed at something Hanakawato had said. Somewhere in the base's ventilation system, a fan knocked rhythmically against its housing. "Where's the receiver address?" Uemura pointed. An open broadcast, no encryption. The entire Frontier Command databank dumped in plain text onto a civilian relays channel that bounced its signal off 17 different booster stations before it arrived anywhere useful. How long until? The base alarm went off. They would later calculate that the Vethkai received the transmission within 40 seconds of its broadcast. The Vethkai were not a reactive civilization. They did not panic. They did not scramble. They processed the data with the serene efficiency of a species that had spent 800 years evolving away from the noise and waste of individual decision-making. Every Vethkai in the sector simply knew what the humans had sent, absorbed it into the collective understanding, and began revising their models accordingly. 4,000 years of recorded history had never once given them a reason to consider that an enemy might hand them a gift this complete. Their probability engines were already rewriting the campaign. Uemura and Tani had not slept in 31 hours, and they were, by any institutional measure, the 2 least consequential people in Frontier Command. They would be the ones who fixed it. The base had a brig, and they spent the first 18 hours in it. The brig was a 4-cell prefab unit that smelled of recycled air and old coffee. Uemura sat on the cot and studied the floor. Tani disassembled and reassembled his multi-tool 17 times. Hanakawato was in the adjacent cell, and he spent most of those hours conducting what he called a strategic assessment, which mostly meant talking. "The thing about this situation," Hanakawato said, from behind the partition, "is that it is recoverable. All situations are recoverable if you know the right people." "We gave them our entire tactical database," Uemura said. "We made a clerical error. Clerical errors happen. We gave them our entire tactical database." "I'm saying the framing matters, Uemura." Tani looked up from his multi-tool. "They're going to hit the Kaida station first," he said. "It's the most exposed installation in the manifest. No rail defenses, old shield grid, 200 personnel." He went back to his tool. "They know everything, every weakness, every gap. They'll run probability models and they'll hit the weakest points in order. Systematic. That's what the intelligence reports say. They're systematic." Silence. "How long?" Uemura asked. "Before they move, if I were running their numbers. 72 hours. Maybe less. Then we need to be out of here in 72 hours." "Yes," Tani agreed. "We do." The man who got them out was not someone you would have predicted. Detective Sergeant Masaru Inumaru had quit the Colonial Police 8 months prior, citing philosophical differences with the department's new AI-assisted predictive policing system. The system flagged suspects based on probability matrices, and Inumaru had spent 20 years doing this job with his gut, his shoes, and a talent for sitting very quietly in rooms until people talked. He'd been given a warning, then a demotion, then 2 weeks of mandatory retraining, and on the last day of retraining he'd submitted his resignation and opened a small private investigations office near the transit docks with a former petty criminal named Tomoyoshi Yaisakura. Sakura had given up theft for similar reasons. The predictive systems had gotten so good that everything he tried to steal was already flagged before he arrived. It had taken the fun out of it. Their office was called Sunset Secret Investigations. The sign kept falling off the door. They had solved 11 cases in 8 months, all of them minor, and they were eating stale protein bars when Hanakawado's emergency contact arrived. "He wants you to get them out," the contact said. Quietly, before the formal review board convenes. "That's obstructing military proceedings," Inomaru said. "He's aware." "I'm not interested in obstructing military proceedings. He's willing to pay a significant sum." Inomaru looked at Sakura. Sakura looked at the protein bars. He'd been eating the same flavor for 6 weeks. "Tell me about the two in the brig," Inomaru said. What they learned over the next 3 hours changed the shape of what Inomaru thought they were doing. They weren't extracting two idiots who'd made a catastrophic clerical error. They were extracting the only two people in Frontier Command who understood what the Vethkai were going to do with the data they'd been given, and who might be able to do something about it. Tani, it turned out, had done his doctoral research on Vethkai computational theory before the war made academic exchange impossible. Uemura had spent 6 years building the tactical database the Vethkai had just received. If anyone alive understood exactly how an alien probability engine would weaponize that information, it was these two. They were also, as Inomaru confirmed on meeting them, almost completely unsuited for anything requiring physical coordination, tactical experience, or the ability to stay calm under pressure. Uemura shook hands 3 times before remembering he'd already done it. Tani walked into a doorframe. "Right," Inomaru said. He didn't say what he was thinking, which was that this was going to be the longest 72 hours of his life. Getting out of the brig was Sakura's department. He'd spent 2 decades noticing the things that people tasked with security never bothered to check. A base is a building. Every building has a rhythm, shift changes, supply drops. The particular 7-minute window when the North Corridor's sensor suite ran its calibration cycle. He had the 4 of them in a maintenance tunnel. Inside 40 minutes, Hanakawado complaining under his breath the entire way about the quality of the ducting. They surfaced near the equipment bay, crouching behind a row of idle loader frames. The base stretched around them, low buildings under a gray sky, the smell of rain on permacrete, the distant whine of atmospheric processors. A supply shuttle sat idle on Pad 3. Sakura studied it the way he'd once studied security systems, looking for the seam. "Where are we going?" Uemura asked. "Kaida Station," Tani said. "Kaida is the first target." "Yes, that's why we're going there." The logic that Tani laid out in the back of the shuttle, as Sakura flew them low and fast over a brown plain of scrubland, was brutal in its simplicity. The Vethkai would run their probability models and strike the weakest point first. They were systematic, predictable. They had been dominant for so long that their strategy had calcified into certainty. They did not improvise because they had never needed to. If you knew their methodology, you knew where they would be and when. You could not outfight them. You might be able to outthink them. "Except the data they received is accurate," Hanakawado said. He had found a thermos of coffee somewhere and was drinking from it with the composure of a man in a meeting he didn't ask to attend. "Every weakness in that database is a real weakness. You can't hide what's already known." "You can't," Tani agreed, "but you can add to it." He pulled out his personal tablet and opened a file he'd been building since the brig. Not a tactical plan. The Vethkai would have already wargamed every tactical plan in the database. What he'd built was a record of everything in the database that was wrong. Not falsified, just outdated. Kaida Station's shield grid had been replaced 6 weeks ago. The weapons manifest listed munitions stockpiles that had been depleted in a firefight 3 months prior, and then replenished with a different configuration. The Vethkai had perfect knowledge of a station that no longer existed quite the way it had when the data was compiled. "So they're attacking the ghost," Uemura said slowly. "They're attacking the model. The model is 6 weeks old in critical ways." Tani looked out the shuttle's scratched window. "But they don't know that. And they have no reason to think we know they don't know it." Kaida Station rose out of the gray dusk like a bad idea made permanent. It was an old installation. Prefab corridors bolted onto a natural rock formation. Shield emitters mounted at angles that made structural sense but defensive nonsense. 211 personnel. A commander named Yashiro, who had been running this posting for 3 years, and had the look of a person who'd long ago made a separate peace with the fact that nothing about this assignment was going to make her career. She was not pleased to see them. "You're the four who caused this," she said. It wasn't a question. "We're the four who can uncause some of it," Inumaru said. He said it the way he'd said things for 20 years. Flat, no qualifier, no hedge. She studied him. He let her. "Tanny," she said, "I've read your work. You're the Vethkai computational theory person." "Yes, sir." "What are they going to do?" he told her. She listened without interrupting, which was how Inumaru knew she was the right kind of commander. When Tani finished, she turned to her window and looked out at the shield emitters for a long time. "So we know where they'll come from," she said, "and we know what they think they're walking into." "Yes. What we need," she said, "is something the database doesn't contain, something they can't model." There was a pause. Inumaru was watching the room. He watched rooms the same way he'd always done it, not the center, where the action was, but the edges, where things got loose. In the corner of Yashiro's command room, a young technician named Hoshi had been watching the conversation with an expression Inumaru recognized. It was the expression of someone who knew something but wasn't sure they should say it. "Technician," he said. She startled. "What are you thinking?" She glanced at the commander. Yashiro nodded once. "We have a pilot," Hoshi said. "Corporal Yoshiko Kanda. She crashed 3 weeks ago on a scouting run. The Vethkai thought she was dead. She was in medical, severe head trauma. Our surgeon had to use a Vethkai neural interface we salvaged from a wreck last year. It was the only thing we had that could bridge the gap." She paused. "She woke up 4 days ago. What does that mean?" Hanakawato asked. "It means she's alive," Hoshi said. And she stopped. Started again. She can hear them. Not words, more like she feels the shape of their coordination. She says it's like hearing an orchestra through a wall. You can't make out the notes, but you can tell where the conductor is standing. The medical bay was 4 corridors away. Yoshiko Kanda was sitting on the edge of her cot when they came in, boots on, jacket half-buttoned, a cup of something hot in her hands. She was younger than Uemura expected, mid-20s, maybe. There was a thin stripe of pale scarring at her right temple where the interface had been placed. She looked at the group of them the way you look at bad weather coming across a flat plain. "They told you," she said. "Yes," Inumaru said. He sat down across from her without being asked. The others stood in the doorway. "Tell me what you hear." She was quiet for a moment. Not gathering courage, gathering precision. He liked that. "It's like they all agree before they decide," she said. "There's no argument, no hesitation. Every unit knows what every other unit knows. It's quiet and it's fast and it's completely," she turned the cup in her hands, "it's completely airless. Like thinking in a vacuum. No friction." She looked up. "I don't know if I can explain to you how frightening that is. Not the power of it. The quiet." "What about now?" Tani asked. He'd stepped past the others. "Right now, are you receiving anything?" She tilted her head. Eyes went unfocused for a moment. "They're close. They've been running projections. She frowned. "They're very confident." "Good," Tani said. "They should be." What followed was not a plan in any military sense. It was more like a series of small disasters that happened to be arranged in the right order. The Vethkai struck at 4 in the morning, local station time. They came in from the southwestern vector exactly as the database indicated. The station was blind, hit the shield emitters the database indicated were weakest, and immediately encountered the fact that the southwestern vector now had a fully operational, secondary sensor array, that the shield emitters they'd targeted had been replaced 6 weeks ago, and ran on a different power configuration entirely, and that the munitions they'd expected to find exhausted were instead freshly stocked, and positioned in ways that made no tactical sense, according to any model in their database, because Uemura had spent 18 hours reorganizing them based on a completely different logic, one he'd designed specifically to look like chaos. It was chaos. Controlled chaos is still chaos. The first 20 minutes were brutal for everyone. The Vethkai adjusted. They were built to adjust. But adjusting to unexpected data takes time, and time runs through probability engines differently than certainty does. Uncertainty slows the collective. Small frictions multiply. They had never needed to move fast in conditions of genuine confusion, because they had never been genuinely confused before. Inumaru was in the south corridor when the first Vethkai units pushed through. He had not carried a weapon in 20 years of police work. His philosophy was that a drawn weapon announced that you'd already lost control of the situation. But Yaisakura had pressed a sidearm into his hands 2 hours earlier without comment, and he was carrying it now without drawing it. Old habits. The Vethkai were tall, jointed in too many places, their movements carrying the deliberate economy of something that had never learned to hurry. They communicated in frequencies he couldn't hear. The lead unit turned its primary sensory cluster in his direction, and he thought, "They're recalculating." In that half-second of recalculation, 3 of Yashishiro's people came in from the side corridor. The fight was short and ugly. Inumaru hit something with his elbow that he wasn't aiming at. It helped. 4 corridors away, in a maintenance closet adjacent to the station's broadcast array, Tani was finishing the most complicated piece of code he had ever written. He was building a transmission. Not weapons data, not military intelligence. He was building a model, a false mirror, a ghost of the station's tactical disposition, fed back to the Vethkai collective in the fragments of frequency they used for internal coordination. Not a lie, something worse than a lie, a plausible truth that contradicted the reality they were experiencing in real time. "Yoshiko," he said. She was next to him, her eyes half closed. "Is it working?" She pressed 2 fingers to her temple. "They're arguing, I can feel them arguing. Not with words. Like static, like a signal breaking up." She opened her eyes. "I've never felt them argue before." "Good," he said, and hit transmit. What Tani understood about Vethkai cognition that most human analysts had missed. Because most human analysts approach the Vethkai the way you approach something you want to defeat, not something you want to understand, was that the collective's strength was also its critical fragility. A mind that does not argue with itself cannot tolerate contradiction. A decision-making system that has never needed to handle genuine ambiguity has no graceful way to process it. Individual humans were worse at calculation, worse at pattern recognition, worse at almost everything the Vethkai did. But humans were spectacularly good at being wrong and continuing to function. They'd had to be. A million years of being the small, slow, soft thing on a planet full of things trying to eat you had produced a cognitive style built entirely around the ability to act on incomplete information, fail, absorb the failure, and keep moving. The Vethkai had no use for that until now. The secondary attack came from the north as the database had indicated it would. Hanakawado was there, which no one had planned. He had wandered north, looking for a secondary coffee supply, and had instead found himself in a corridor where 3 of Yashiro's people were trying to hold a choke point with equipment that kept jamming. Hanakawado had spent 30 years in corporate environments, where nothing worked the way it was supposed to, and the schedule was always impossible. And the only way to survive was to smile through it and find the angle everyone else had missed. He looked at the jammed equipment, asked 2 questions, and identified a workaround that had nothing to do with any tactical manual ever written. It had to do with the way power rerouted through secondary conjs when the primary circuit was overloaded, which he knew because the same logic applied to the auxiliary heating system on a supply station he'd managed 4 years ago. He explained this very quickly. Yashiro's people implemented it. The choke point held. Afterward, one of the soldiers looked at him and said, "Where did you learn that?" "Meetings," Hanakawado said. Yaisakura took down 4 Vethkai units in the Eastern Maintenance Tunnel with a technique he'd developed for bypassing security gates, which it turned out translated surprisingly well to situations where you needed to move through a confined space without being seen. He had no military training. He had something better. A profound, lifelong expertise in the gap between where people were looking and where you actually were. The crisis came at hour 3. The Vethkai had been thrown off model twice, once by the physical layout, once by Tani's false transmission, and they were recalibrating. They were slow by their standards. But they were not stopping. You could feel it through the station's sensors. A methodical, relentless pressure, the way deep water presses on a sealed vessel. They were going to find the real model eventually. They had too many units, too much processing power. The question was not whether the humans could defeat them. The question was whether they could make it costly enough to matter. Yoshiko came out of the maintenance closet and walked to the station's main broadcast array. Yamura saw her from across the operations room. "Corporal Kanda, what are you doing?" She looked at him. There was something in her face that was different now. Not wrong, not the absence of who she was, but layered. Like a chord where before there'd been a single note. "I know what they hear," she said. "I know the frequency they use to coordinate. And I know." She put her hand on the broadcast array's primary input. "I know something they can't model." She broadcasted herself, not tactically, not militarily. She put herself on their frequency and she sang. It was an old song, something her mother had sung, she said later. A folk song, not particularly beautiful, with a rhythm that was deeply and specifically human, off time in a way that felt intentional. Not a signal, not a code. Just the irreducible texture of a person who was made of experiences that had no tactical value whatsoever. Transmitted on the frequency the Vethkai used to think, the collective had been processing the battle, running models, updating probabilities, adjusting for each unexpected variable. And then, through the frequency they used to coordinate, came something they had no category for. Not noise they could filter. Not a transmission, they understood transmissions. What came through was the shape of a mind that wasn't running any calculation at all. Just present, just human, in all its messy specificity. The particular way she bent the melody in the second phrase, because that was how her mother had done it. The small catch in her breath before the high note. The collective had no model for it, because there was no model. There was just her. Tani was monitoring their coordination frequency. He watched it break apart in real time. Not collapse, not cut out, but lose its coherence the way light breaks when it hits a prism. The probability engines were still running. They just didn't agree anymore on what they were computing. It bought 17 minutes. 17 minutes of Vethkai units standing still in corridors, of the relentless pressure lifting, of Yashiro's people moving into gaps that should not have existed. 17 minutes was enough. The reinforcement shuttle from base Ardua hit atmosphere 11 minutes into those 17. Commander Yashiro had sent the request at the start of the battle and had not mentioned it to anyone. Not because she wanted the credit, but because she'd been doing this long enough to know that telling people help was coming made them stop doing the things that kept them alive until it arrived. The shuttle's arrival was not the victory. It was the confirmation that the victory had already been decided by people with no business deciding it. The Vethkai withdrew. They did not rout. They did not break. They recalculated, found that their probability engines could not produce a confident model of what they were dealing with, and withdrew to reassess. For a species built entirely on the premise that sufficient information produced reliable outcomes, the experience of genuinely unreliable data was not defeat. It was something worse than defeat. It was doubt. Inamaru was sitting on the floor of the south corridor with his back against the wall when it was over, breathing slowly. Yaisakura sat down beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. Somewhere in the station, someone was laughing, the slightly hysterical laughter of people who had been very frightened for a long time and were now not frightened, and the transition was too fast to handle any other way. "Are we in trouble?" Yaisakura asked. "Considerable trouble," Inamaru said. "The brig again?" "Probably more formal than the brig." Yaisakura considered this. "Worth it?" Inumaru thought about the four of them in the maintenance tunnel, about Taniai's hands shaking on the tablet as he worked, about Yoshiko's voice going out on the alien frequency, into all that coordinated silence, carrying something that could not be calculated because it was not a calculation. "Ask me something easier," he said. The formal review took 3 weeks. There were 11 separate inquiries, 4 subcommittees, 2 generals who gave speeches, and 1 memorable session where Hanakawato appeared before a review board in his dress uniform, and somehow turned a cross-examination about unauthorized access to military detention facilities into a 40-minute discussion of procurement inefficiencies that had been costing the Colonial Defense Network money for years. 2 of the generals took notes. Hanakawato was offered a civilian advisory position the following morning. Wamura and Tani were not court-martialed. They received formal censures, which would follow them in their records, and mean nothing within 6 months. Because the defense community is small, and the people who mattered had already heard the story. The censure was the official version, the actual version, that 2 exhausted technicians had turned a catastrophic mistake into a functioning piece of intelligence about Vethkai cognitive vulnerabilities, had already spread through the channels where the actual version always spreads. Inumaru went back to Sunset Secret Investigations. The sign fell off the door the day after he returned, and he put it back up. It fell off again the following Tuesday. He decided to stop fixing it. Yoshiko Kanda was cleared for active duty, contingent on ongoing evaluations of the neural interface's long-term effects. She passed every evaluation. She also, in the months that followed, worked with Tani on a series of increasingly refined versions of the broadcast technique she'd stumbled into during the battle. Not songs, eventually. Something more structured. A kind of signal that was built from the basic material of human experience. Non-deterministic, irregular, full of the contradictions and emotional noise that Vethkai probability engines had no way to process. They never named it anything formal. In the field, people started calling it static, as in run the static, as in hit them with the static. Tani's original paper on Vethkai computational theory, which he'd written 6 years ago and which had been classified for 3 of those years, was quietly declassified and circulated to 11 research institutions. He got 2 letters from former professors. One said, "I knew you were onto something." The other said, "I owe you an apology and a drink." The first time Oamura was entrusted with a sensitive transmission after the review period, he triple-checked the routing address, then had Tani verify it, then stared at the send button for 45 seconds before pressing it. The transmission arrived exactly where it was supposed to. He didn't sleep well for 6 months. That was also fine. He had never slept particularly well. The battle at Kaida Station was not, by any measure, a decisive engagement. The Vethkai did not retreat from the frontier. They did not change their fundamental strategy. What they did, and this took analysts 2 years to confirm, was introduce a new protocol into their collective coordination, a set of contingency processes for managing genuine ambiguity, a kind of noise tolerance. They had encountered something they couldn't model, and they had, in their deliberate and systematic way, tried to learn from it. The analysts who noticed this argued for years about what it meant. Some thought it made the Vethkai more dangerous, a species that had now patched the cognitive gap that had been exploited. Others argued something different, that in building the capacity to handle ambiguity, the Vethkai had introduced the thing they'd never had, the thing that every messy, argumentative, irrational, inconsistent human carried around like weight. They'd introduced uncertainty, not just the capacity to model it, the experience of it. Whether that was good or bad, nobody could agree. The sign fell off the Sunset Secret Investigation's door again, on a Wednesday in late autumn, 3 years after the battle. Inumaru propped it against the wall and stood in the doorway, looking out at the transit docks, the foot traffic, the cargo loaders, the general productive chaos of a place that had been built by people improvising their way through circumstances that hadn't come with instructions. A woman he didn't recognize caught his eye and nodded as she passed. The way you nod at someone when the morning is cold and ordinary, and nothing terrible is happening. He left the sign where it was. Behind him, Yesakura put water on for coffee, and the kettle was the wrong temperature, and they argued about it for 20 minutes. And outside, in the middle distance, a Vethkai sensor drone hung motionless in the upper atmosphere as it had every morning for 3 months, watching without conclusion, its probability engines running and running over a species that kept producing data it had no prior model to contain. The morning was cold, the coffee was too hot. The sign leaned against the wall and nobody fixed it. On Kaida Station, Yoshiko Kanda woke up before Reveille, sat on the edge of her cot with her boots already on, and listened. Through the interface at her right temple, barely perceptible like an orchestra heard through a very thick wall, the shape of them, the orderly, airless, achingly confident hum of a civilization that had just for the first time introduced a wrong note into its own composition. She drank her coffee. She hummed something her mother had taught her, off time in the way her mother had always done it. Then she put on her jacket and went to work.